On the chilly afternoon of May 6, 2008, a 54-year-old man named Ricky Williams was standing on the muddy bank of Dismal Creek in western Virginia. He was holding a fishing rod in his hand, feeling the rough texture of the grip against his worn palm, and casting his line out into the cold, rushing water. He had been standing in that exact spot for about 30 minutes, casting the lure and slowly reeling it back in, but so far he had not gotten a single bite. Normally, this wouldn't have bothered him at all. Ricky was the kind of guy who absolutely loved the outdoors. He could spend hours and hours standing on a riverbank, lost in his own thoughts, completely content even if he did not catch a single fish. But today, the situation was very different. Today, Ricky and his dog, a loyal companion who was sitting quietly on the damp grass right next to him, were absolutely starving. They had been living out in these deep woods, camping in a small tent for several weeks now, and their food supply had finally run down to nothing. They had eaten their very last can of beans the night before, and now their survival depended entirely on whether or not Ricky could catch some trout. If he failed to catch anything today, neither he nor his dog would have anything to eat tonight. Now, for some important context, where Ricky was fishing was a place called Dismal Creek. Despite its incredibly bleak and depressing name, it was actually a beautiful, secluded spot nestled on top of a high mountain. This mountain was located directly on the Appalachian Trail, which is a massive and famous 2,200-mile-long hiking trail that runs all the way up and down the east coast of the United States, stretching from Georgia all the way to Maine. And the reason this location is so important to our story is because of a very special, unwritten code that exists among the people who hike on the Appalachian Trail. It is a code of mutual survival and community. Every single person who sets foot on the trail is well aware of this rule. It basically states that if you are out in the wilderness and you encounter another hiker who is in trouble, who is hungry, injured, or lost, it is your absolute moral responsibility to help them in any way you can. And in return, if you are ever the one who finds yourself in a desperate situation, you can expect any stranger you meet on the trail to offer you food, shelter, or assistance. It is a beautiful system built on trust and empathy. Ricky was very familiar with this trail code, and as he stood there casting his line over and over again into the cold water, he was secretly hoping that some hikers would come walking down the trail. He hoped they would see him, strike up a friendly conversation, realize that he was weak and completely out of food, and offer him some of their supplies. But another half hour slowly ticked by, and the trail remained completely empty. The only sound was the rushing water of Dismal Creek and the rustling of the leaves in the wind. Ricky still had not caught a single fish, and his hopes were beginning to fade. Then, out of nowhere, Ricky's dog stood up. The dog began to whine softly, its ears twitching back and forth as it stared intently into the thick forest behind them. The dog's body went stiff, and it began shifting its weight from side to side, acting incredibly nervous, almost as if it could sense a predator or some kind of hidden danger lurking just beyond the tree line. Ricky reached down, gently patting the dog's head to try and calm it down, but then he heard it too. It was a human voice. The sound of a man talking was echoing through the dense woods, and it was clear that whoever it was, they were moving directly toward Ricky's position. On one hand, Ricky felt a sudden wave of excitement. He thought that this might finally be a friendly hiker who could offer him some food and help him out of his desperate situation. But on the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. You see, Ricky was an older man, and he was quite physically frail. Over the past few weeks of camping, as his food had slowly run out, he had lost a significant amount of weight. He was incredibly skinny, weak, and had very little physical strength left. He was in no condition to defend himself if this stranger turned out to be hostile or dangerous, and while the Appalachian Trail is generally a very safe and peaceful place for outdoor enthusiasts, it does have a dark history. Over the past few decades, there have actually been several notorious murders committed along the trail. In fact, one of the most famous and brutal double homicides in the history of the Appalachian Trail had taken place less than 2 miles away from the very spot where Ricky was standing. In that horrific case, a highly dangerous and well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had shot and stabbed 2 helpless hikers to death. Ricky was well aware of this dark history, and he knew exactly how close he was to that old murder site. This knowledge made him incredibly nervous as he listened to the heavy footsteps and the male voice getting closer and closer through the thick underbrush. Finally, the branches parted, and a man in his early 30s stepped out of the tree line and onto the riverbank. The stranger stopped and looked over at Ricky and his dog. For a few long, tense seconds, the 2 men just stood there, staring at one another in the quiet forest, but then the younger man's face relaxed, and he gave Ricky a warm, friendly grin. He waved and said, "Hey, how you doing?" Ricky immediately felt a massive wave of relief wash over him. Just looking at this guy, he could tell he did not seem dangerous or threatening in any way. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston. He explained to Ricky that he was camping nearby with a friend, and they had come down to the creek to do some fishing, just like Ricky was doing. Ricky didn't waste any time. He introduced himself as Ricky, and then he immediately asked if Scott had any extra food to spare because he was completely out. Scott didn't hesitate for a second. He smiled, unzipped his backpack, and pulled out a couple of energy bars and a bag of potato chips, tossing them over to Ricky. He also reached into his bag and handed Ricky some fresh, high-quality bait so Ricky would have a better chance of catching some trout. For the next couple of hours, the two men stood side by side on the bank of Dismal Creek, casting their lines and chatting about life. Eventually, the fish started biting, and they managed to catch a decent number of trout. What had started as a stressful, hungry day had turned into a wonderful afternoon for Ricky. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the water, Scott turned to Ricky and asked if he would like to come back to his campsite for dinner. He said his friend was a great cook, and they could cook up all the fish they had just caught together. Since Ricky had no other food, this was an incredibly generous offer. Ricky happily accepted, packed up his minimal gear, and followed Scott as they started walking back into the dense forest, leaving the riverbank behind. As they walked up the steep hill, the woods became very dark. Suddenly, Scott's fishing pole got caught on a low-hanging tree branch. Scott tried to untangle it, but the line was wrapped tightly around the twigs. After struggling with it for a minute, Scott turned to Ricky and told him to go on ahead. He said the campsite was just a straight shot up the hill, right in a clearing, and he would catch up as soon as he got his line free. Ricky asked if he was sure, and Scott insisted it was fine. So Ricky and his dog continued walking up the path alone. When Ricky stepped out of the thick trees and into the clearing of the campsite, he froze. Sitting by the campfire was a massive man. This guy was easily twice the size of Scott, which meant he was about 4 times the size of the frail, elderly Ricky. The huge man was hunched over the fire, but when he heard Ricky step into the clearing, he immediately whipped his head around. Finding a stranger standing on the edge of his campsite in the pitch black with no sign of his friend Scott, the big man instantly became suspicious. He reached down, grabbed a thick wooden club from the ground, and stood up, glaring at Ricky with a cold, menacing look. Ricky was completely terrified. He put his hands up in the air and began apologizing. He explained that Scott had sent him up ahead and that he was sorry if he had walked into the wrong place. But just as the tension was reaching a breaking point, Scott emerged from the trees, smiling and carrying his untangled fishing pole. He walked over, patted Ricky on the back, and introduced him to his giant friend, whose name was Sean. As soon as Sean saw Scott, his entire posture changed. He put the wooden club back down on the ground, and the hostile look vanished from his face. But even though the immediate danger had passed, Ricky could tell that Sean was not happy about having a stranger in their camp. Despite the cold shoulder from Sean, Scott was incredibly welcoming. He ushered Ricky over to the campfire, telling him to take a seat right next to Sean. He kept telling Ricky that Sean was an amazing cook and would whip up their fresh fish in no time. Ricky felt very awkward and wanted to just politely excuse himself and leave, but Scott was being very pushy, almost forcing him to stay. Not wanting to seem rude or ungrateful for the food Scott had given him, Ricky reluctantly sat down on a log right next to the silent, imposing Sean. Scott walked over and handed all the trout they had caught to Sean, who silently began preparing them. Then, Scott walked away from the fire and over to his pickup truck, which was parked next to Sean's Jeep at the edge of the clearing. He opened the truck door, turned the key in the ignition, and began blasting loud country music through the speakers. When the music started blaring, Ricky couldn't help but wince. To Ricky, the whole point of being out in nature on the Appalachian Trail was to enjoy the peace, quiet, and solitude. Blasting loud music in the middle of a beautiful, pristine forest felt incredibly disrespectful. Between the aggressive country music and Sean's cold, silent treatment, Ricky started to feel like there was something seriously off about these two men. He felt they were pushy, disrespectful, and potentially dangerous. But he stayed put because he was still incredibly hungry, and his dog was sitting by his feet waiting for food. A moment later, Scott walked back over to the campfire and sat down next to Sean. Both men pulled out their pocket knives and began deboning the fish. Ricky sat there in silence, watching the firelight glint off the sharp metal blades as they worked. Trying to ease his own discomfort, Ricky politely asked if they had another knife so he could help them clean the fish. But the two men barely looked up, waving him off and saying they had it under control. This left Ricky with nothing to do but sit there and watch them handle their knives in the dark, which only made him more anxious. Eventually, the knives were put away and the fish were placed over the open flames to cook. As the delicious smell of cooking fish filled the air, Ricky felt the tension ease slightly. At least they weren't handling weapons anymore. To try and break the awkward silence, Ricky started making small talk. He began telling Sean and Scott about how much he loved the wilderness and how he spent weeks at a time living out on the Appalachian Trail with his dog. He explained that he often felt more at home in the deep woods than he did in society. For him, being out in nature was almost a religious, spiritual experience. He even admitted that when he was alone in the forest, he would often meditate, pray, and perform chants as a way to connect with Mother Nature. As Ricky shared these deeply personal details, he noticed that Sean and Scott were listening, but they were looking at him with very strange expressions. It was obvious they thought he was a total weirdo. They didn't say anything, but their subtle smirks and uncomfortable glances made Ricky feel deeply embarrassed. He realized he had shared way too much with two strangers who clearly didn't care for him. Fortunately, the fish finished cooking right at that moment, putting an end to the conversation. The three men sat in complete silence, wolfing down their food. By the time they finished eating, it was around 8 o'clock at night and the forest was pitch black. Ricky decided he had stayed long enough. He thanked Sean and Scott for the dinner, got up from his seat, whistled for his dog, and began walking away from the warm glow of the campfire, heading back down the dark trail toward his own secluded campsite. But after taking only about 10 or 15 steps into the dark woods, two things happened in rapid succession. First, for some reason, Ricky suddenly stopped walking and turned around to look back at the campfire. And second, the moment he turned, an incredibly loud, deafening bang echoed through the quiet forest, sounding like a violent explosion. About 30 minutes after that loud bang and roughly 4 miles away from the campsite, two women were sitting inside their quiet home eating dinner. Out of nowhere, a frantic, heavy pounding started on their front door. Because they lived in a very isolated rural area, this sudden noise terrified them. One of the women immediately ran to the phone, ready to dial 911, while the other cautiously walked toward the front window to peer outside. It was too dark to see anything on the porch, but the pounding on the door was getting louder and more desperate. Summoning her courage, the woman unlocked the door and opened it just a tiny crack. What she saw on her porch made her gasp in horror. Standing there was a man who was completely covered in dark red blood, from his head down to his chest, as if he had been fully submerged in a pool of it. The man was pressing his hand tightly against his neck, but blood was visibly pulsing and spraying out from between his fingers, perfectly in time with his heartbeat. He was clearly bleeding to death, right on her doorstep. The woman screamed to her friend to call 911 immediately. The dying man looked at her with wild, terrified eyes, whispered the words, "Please help me," muttered something about Dismal Creek, and then collapsed heavily onto the wooden porch. The woman stood there in shock, completely frozen, but as she stared down at the unconscious man, she noticed a Jeep idling out on the road in front of her house, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Before she could make sense of what was happening, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, and within minutes, an ambulance and several police cars came speeding up her driveway. The paramedics jumped out, rushed onto the porch, loaded the bleeding man onto a stretcher, and sped away to the hospital. Meanwhile, the police officers on the scene took the information about Dismal Creek and immediately headed toward the mountain road. They knew that whatever had happened to this man must have started up at the creek, and they needed to find out if there were other victims or a killer still lurking in the woods. As the police cars sped up the winding, dark mountain road toward Dismal Creek, they suddenly saw a set of headlights coming directly toward them at a high speed. It was a pickup truck, and it was driving incredibly fast. As the truck approached the police convoy, the driver briefly tapped the brakes, but then, instead of pulling over, the driver slammed on the gas. The truck veered violently off the road, plowed into a steep dirt embankment, flipped over multiple times, and came to a crushing halt on its side. The police officers pulled over and ran toward the smoking wreck with their guns drawn. They couldn't understand why the driver had suddenly accelerated and crashed into the embankment on purpose. When they looked inside the crushed cab, they found a single man, bloody but still breathing. They pulled him out of the wreckage and called for another ambulance. Even though they didn't have any proof yet, the officers felt certain that this reckless driver was connected to the bleeding man who had shown up on the porch. They decided to send a police officer in the ambulance with the driver to keep him under guard at the hospital. Once the crash scene was clear, the rest of the officers continued up the mountain to Dismal Creek. When they arrived, they turned on their high-powered flashlights and began searching the dense forest, looking for any clues that might explain the night's chaotic events. Soon, they stumbled upon a campsite. But as they looked around, they realized this was not the neat, organized campsite where Sean and Scott had been staying. This was a completely different, highly disturbing campsite hidden deep in the underbrush. The campsite consisted of just a small, weathered tent and a cold fire pit. But when the officers unzipped the tent and shone their lights inside, they were deeply unsettled by what they found. Laid out inside the tent was a collection of 30 extremely sharp knives. Next to the knives was a functional police scanner, which was tuned to the local frequency, allowing whoever lived here to monitor the police movements in real time. But the strangest find was the clothing. There were neat piles of clothes sorted by size and gender, including children's clothes, adult clothes, men's clothes, and women's clothes. There was also a pile of prescription eyeglasses and 8 pairs of women's underwear. Hanging on the tent wall was a detailed map of the Appalachian Trail. Scattered across the map were dozens of handwritten red circles, marking specific isolated locations along the trail. One of those circled spots was Dismal Creek. On the floor of the tent sat a small cassette player with a tape inside. One of the officers pressed play, and a chilling sound filled the quiet tent. It was a recording of a man's voice howling, chanting, and muttering in what sounded like a bizarre, dark ritual. But the most important piece of evidence in the entire tent was a single, official document. It was a birth certificate. When the officers read the name on the certificate, their jaws dropped. Every police officer in the state of Virginia, and anyone who lived near the Appalachian Trail, knew that name. It was the key that connected the explosion at the campfire, the bloody man on the porch, and the truck crash on the mountain road. To understand what happened, we have to go back to the moment Ricky Williams walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite. After taking a few steps, Ricky stopped and turned around. The loud explosion that echoed through the woods was not a random sound. It was the sound of Ricky firing a gun. While Sean and Scott were looking at each other in complete shock, Sean reached up to touch his face. When he pulled his hand away, it was covered in thick, warm blood. Ricky had shot Sean directly in the face. Before they could even process what was happening, Ricky ran out of the darkness and back into the campsite, firing his gun repeatedly. Sean, severely wounded and bleeding heavily from his face, staggered backward and collapsed onto the ground. Scott, who was uninjured, jumped up and sprinted into the dark woods to escape. Ricky turned, aimed at the running man, and fired, hitting Scott directly in the back of the neck and the shoulder. Despite these horrific injuries, Scott's adrenaline kept him moving, and he disappeared into the dark forest. With Scott gone, Ricky walked over to the helpless Sean, who was lying on the ground, and calmly fired another bullet directly into his chest. But miraculously, the second gunshot triggered an incredible surge of adrenaline in Sean. Instead of dying, he scrambled to his feet, ran to his Jeep, started the engine, and tore out of the campsite as fast as he could. As Sean sped down the bumpy dirt road, his headlights illuminated a figure stumbling out of the woods. It was Scott, clutching his bleeding neck. Sean slammed on the brakes, Scott threw open the door and scrambled inside, and Sean hit the gas again, driving desperately toward the nearest sign of life, which turned out to be the house where the two women were eating dinner. Scott was the one who managed to drag himself to the door to beg for help, while Sean was left drifting into unconsciousness in the passenger seat of the Jeep. The man who had crashed his truck while fleeing the police was indeed the man who called himself Ricky Williams. But Ricky Williams did not exist. It was a fake name. The driver's real name, as shown on the birth certificate found in the creepy tent, was Randall Lee Smith. This was the exact same Randall Lee Smith who had brutally murdered two young hikers on the Appalachian Trail back in 1981. After serving 15 years of his sentence, he had been paroled in 1996 for good behavior. He had lived quietly with his mother for a decade under strict supervision, but once his monitoring bracelet was removed, his life fell apart. He ran out of money, packed up his dog, and retreated back to the wilderness of the trail he knew so well. No one knows why Randall decided to attack Sean and Scott that night. He was a deeply disturbed man who likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as his private sacred home, and perhaps he felt the two young men were trespassing or disrespecting his forest. Sean and Scott, who survived the horrific ordeal, later said they only felt pity for the older man, believing he was just a homeless drifter who needed a hot meal. They had no idea they were sharing a fire with a notorious serial killer. The police suspect the items in Randall's tent, including the women's underwear and eyeglasses, may have belonged to other hikers who went missing on the trail, but the DNA on those items did not match any known cases, and the other, circled spots on the map yielded no clues. Randall Lee Smith took his secrets to the grave, dying in police custody from a blood clot just 4 days after his truck crashed. Today, Sean still lives with bullet fragments in his head and chest, and Scott bears deep physical scars, but both men survived and remarkably still returned to the woods of Virginia to camp and fish. Let us now travel back in time to another terrifying incident that occurred in the freezing wilderness of the American West, where a group of hopeful men set out to find a fortune but ended up meeting a fate so gruesome that it is still spoken of with hushed whispers today. On the freezing cold night of February 8, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan sat huddled close to a roaring campfire deep inside a snowy valley in western Colorado. Around him sat a group of 5 other rugged men, all of whom were gold prospectors. These men spent their lives traveling across the wild frontiers of America, searching for rich veins of gold in the mountains that could make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But for the past several weeks, this particular group of prospectors had been completely trapped in this isolated valley. A series of brutal winter storms had rolled through the mountains, dumping up to 6 feet of heavy snow at a time, making it absolutely impossible for them to travel. As Israel warmed his hands by the fire, listening to the crackle of the dry pine wood and the quiet conversation of the men, one of his friends stood up. His name was Alfred Packer, though most people called him Alfred due to a misspelling on a tattoo he had inked on his arm. Alfred was a 30-year-old prospector who was generally disliked by the rest of the group. They thought he was lazy, greedy, and incredibly difficult to work with. But Israel actually liked Alfred. He thought Alfred was brave, ambitious, and misunderstood. Israel believed the real reason the other men disliked Alfred was because of his severe epilepsy. Alfred suffered from frequent violent seizures, which made the other prospectors view him as a dangerous liability on a harsh winter trek where everyone needed to pull their own weight. But Israel did not care about that. He saw potential in the young man and felt a sort of fatherly protection over him. Alfred stood before the seated group, the firelight dancing across his face, and began pitching an incredibly bold plan. He told the men that the weather was finally starting to clear up and the deep snow was beginning to melt. Alfred claimed he knew of a secret direct route out of the valley that could get them to the town of Breckenridge, Colorado in just 2 weeks. Breckenridge was a legendary gold mining hub, and Alfred promised that if they left right now, they would be the first ones to stake claims on the richest gold deposits before the spring rush of other miners. Israel watched the faces of the other men around the fire. Most of them remained silent, looking highly skeptical. Then, a very large man sitting across the circle slowly shook his head. This man was not a gold prospector. His name was Ure, and he was the respected chief of the Tabach band of the Ute tribe. Chief Ure had actually saved the lives of Israel, Alfred, and the rest of the prospectors a few weeks earlier. He had found them wandering aimlessly in a blinding blizzard on the very brink of starvation. Chief Ure and his tribe had brought them food, helped them build a shelter near the river, and told them to stay put until the spring, when the mountain passes would be safe to cross. Chief Ure stood up, towering over Alfred, and held his hand out, silencing the young prospector. He looked Alfred dead in the eye and said in a calm, serious voice that if they chose to leave the valley now, they would all die in the mountains. The warning was clear and chilling, and the entire campsite fell into a tense, heavy silence. But Israel was under immense pressure. He had promised his family back home that this would be his very last prospecting trip, and he desperately needed to find gold so he could retire and support them. He could not afford to wait in this valley for months doing nothing. Alfred broke the silence, politely thanking Chief Ure for his warning, but declaring that he was going to take his chances and leave the next morning. He asked if anyone had the courage to join him. Driven by his desperate need for gold, Israel stood up and volunteered. Inspired by his choice, 4 other prospectors also stepped forward, agreeing to join the trek. Chief Ure realized he could not change their minds, so he decided to help them survive. He drew a map in the dirt on the ground, showing them a river they must follow around the base of the massive San Juan Mountains. He warned them repeatedly never to try to go over the high peaks, as the storms there would kill them. He marked a spot on the dirt map with an X, explaining there was a supply outpost on the other side of the mountains where they could rest and get more food. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers packed their heavy gear. Another prospector who was staying behind in the safe valley offered to load some of their heavy supplies onto his horse and walk with them for the first day to make their journey easier. The group set off into the freezing cold, heading toward the towering, jagged peaks of the San Juans. Israel walked through the deep snow, clutching a metal coffee pot filled with burning hot coals. This was an old wilderness trick. The coals kept his hands warm and ensured they could easily start a fire even if their matches got wet. As they hiked, Alfred fell in line next to Israel. He looked miserable, shivering violently in the biting wind. Feeling sorry for the young man, Israel handed him the warm coffee pot. Alfred clutched it gratefully, and in return, he pulled a flask of whiskey from his coat and offered Israel a drink. The 2 men walked side by side, sharing the warmth of the coals and the whiskey, feeling optimistic about the fortune waiting for them in Breckenridge. By that afternoon, the prospector with the horse stopped, explaining his animal could go no further in the deep snow. He dropped their supplies, wished them luck, and turned back, leaving the 6 men completely on their own in the freezing wilderness. 2 weeks passed, but the 6 prospectors never arrived at the supply outpost on the other side of the San Juans. Another 2 weeks went by, and still there was no sign of them. Shortly after they had left the valley, the temporary break in the weather had ended, and a series of monstrous blizzards had slammed into the mountains, burying the trails under feet of fresh snow. Deep in the valley, Chief Ure and the remaining prospectors could only wait, knowing there was no way to launch a rescue mission in such extreme conditions. On April 16, 1874, nearly 2 months after the group had departed, the officials running the supply outpost on the far side of the mountains were sitting inside their warm cabin eating breakfast. Suddenly, the front door was kicked open. Standing in the doorway was a terrifying, ghostly figure. The man had wild, matted hair, a long, filthy beard, and bloodshot eyes. He was clutching a rifle in one hand and a battered metal coffee pot in the other. He was shivering violently, unable to speak, and looked to be on the absolute verge of collapse. It was Alfred. The officials rushed him inside, wrapped him in warm blankets, and set a plate of food in front of him. Alfred began devouring the food like a wild animal, but his starved stomach could not handle it, and he immediately threw up on the floor. He apologized, begging for a glass of whiskey to settle his nerves. After drinking the spirits, Alfred finally calmed down enough to speak. The officials asked him what had happened to his companions. Alfred closed his eyes, his face twisting in pain, and told a tragic story. He claimed that after they set off, they became hopelessly lost in a massive blizzard. In their desperation, the other 5 men had decided to ignore Chief Ure's warnings and try to climb directly over the high peaks of the San Juan Mountains. Alfred, weakened by his epilepsy, had struggled to keep up in the deep snow. He claimed that his friends, realizing he was slowing them down, had heartlessly abandoned him in the middle of a whiteout, leaving him to die. Alfred claimed he had survived for 2 months by huddling in snow caves, eating frozen pine needles, roots, and at one point, boiling and eating his own leather shoes. He said the only reason he kept going was the warmth of the hot coals inside Israel's metal coffee pot, which allowed him to start small fires at night. He asked the officials if any of the other 5 men had made it to the outpost, and they sadly informed him that he was the sole survivor because Alfred was too weak to travel and the mountain passes were still choked with snow. No immediate search was launched. Alfred stayed at the outpost for several weeks, gradually regaining his strength and weight. But as the snow began to melt in the early summer, rumors started to circulate. Some of the men at the outpost noticed that Alfred had a surprising amount of money on him, and he had been seen carrying several pocket watches that did not belong to him. The horrifying truth was finally revealed in August of 1874. A traveling landscape artist named John Randolph was hiking through a remote forest near the base of the San Juan Mountains, sketching the beautiful summer scenery. As he walked into a secluded clearing, he was hit by a wave of an incredibly foul, rotting odor. He followed the smell and discovered an abandoned, overgrown campsite. When John stepped into the clearing, he froze in absolute terror. Lying on the ground, arranged in a neat, straight row, were 5 human corpses. The bodies were in various states of decay, but it was immediately obvious that they had not died from starvation or freezing. One of the bodies was missing its head entirely. The other 4 had massive, horrific fractures in their skulls, indicating they had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object, like an axe or a club, but the most disturbing detail was the state of the bodies. Several of the corpses had been surgically dissected. Their chests and thighs had been sliced open with clean, precise cuts, and large portions of their muscle and flesh had been neatly carved away, as if a butcher had been preparing meat. A short distance away, John found a cold fire pit containing charred, blackened human bones. Further back in the trees, there was a small, hand-built shelter that showed signs of being occupied for weeks. John realized with horror that someone had murdered these 5 men and had been living in this camp. Systematically feeding on their remains, John fled the forest and immediately notified the authorities. An investigation was launched, and it quickly became clear that the dead men were Israel Swan and the other 4 missing prospectors. The evidence pointed directly to Alfred Packer. He was arrested and brought in for questioning. Faced with the gruesome discovery of the bodies, Alfred's story quickly fell apart. While Alfred tried to claim that the men had turned on each other out of hunger, and that he had only killed Israel Swan in self-defense after Israel went mad with starvation, the forensic evidence told a very different story. 4 of the men had been killed while they lay asleep in their blankets, their skulls crushed before they ever had a chance to defend themselves. The only man who showed signs of a struggle was 65-year-old Israel Swan, the very man who had looked out for Alfred, shared his warm coffee pot, and treated him like a son. The search of the campsite also revealed that Alfred had not been starving at all. Investigators found the carcass of a freshly killed deer near his shelter, but Alfred had apparently ignored the animal meat, choosing instead to continue feeding on the bodies of his companions. He had also stolen all their money, gold dust, and personal belongings, which explained the cash and pocket watches he had been spending at the outpost. Alfred Packer was put on trial, convicted of murder, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. His case became one of the most famous and shocking stories of cannibalism in American history. Remarkably, while in prison, Alfred became a model inmate and reportedly became a strict vegetarian, refusing to ever eat meat again. He was paroled in 1901 and lived quietly until his death, leaving behind a dark, haunting legacy in the mountains of Colorado. Let us now move forward to a much more modern mystery, one that took place in a bustling American city but involved a level of survival and biological mystery that left seasoned doctors and police officers completely dumbfounded. On the afternoon of May 25, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon lay perfectly still on the couch in her Atlanta, Georgia apartment. The living room was pitch black. She had pulled all the heavy curtains shut and taped cardboard over the windows to block out every single sliver of sunlight. She had a massive, throbbing ice pack pressed against her forehead, and her eyes were squeezed shut in absolute agony. Nicole was suffering from a blinding, agonizing headache that felt like a hot iron was being pressed directly into her skull. It was, without a question, the worst pain she had ever experienced in her entire life. This horrific headache had been going on for exactly 3 weeks, and it had not eased up for even a single second. Nicole had no idea why her head hurt so bad. The only logical explanation she could think of was a car accident she had been in 3 weeks earlier. She remembered being in her car and there had been a sudden, violent collision. Her driver's side window had shattered, and she remembered feeling a sharp pain on her face and forehead, followed by the feeling of warm blood trickling down her skin. She had assumed at the time that a sharp shard of flying glass had cut her forehead. She had cleaned the cut, put a bandage on it, and figured she would heal in a few days. But instead of healing, this monstrous headache had developed, completely paralyzing her, but Nicole was an incredibly stubborn and tough woman. She hated going to the doctor, and she kept telling herself that it was just a severe migraine caused by the stress of the accident. She was convinced that if she just stayed in a dark room, took enough over-the-counter pain medication, and rested, the pain would eventually go away. As she lay there, she heard the quiet creak of her back door opening. She did not panic, because she knew it was her boyfriend Durante. He stepped into the kitchen, carrying several bags of groceries. He put the food away and then walked into the dark living room, speaking in a low whisper so he wouldn't aggravate her headache. He asked how she was feeling, and Nicole groaned, telling him the pain was still a 10 out of 10. She asked if he would please get her some ibuprofen and a cold glass of water. Durante quietly walked back to the kitchen, fetched the medicine and water, and handed them to her. Nicole swallowed the pills, placed the ice pack back over her eyes, and tried to drift off to sleep. Suddenly, a loud, heavy knock rattled the front door. Durante walked over to the window and gently parted the blinds to peek outside. He turned back to Nicole and whispered that her best friend Lisa was standing on the porch. He asked if she wanted him to open the door, but Nicole quickly shook her head, telling him to just ignore it and pretend no one was home. Nicole and Lisa had been incredibly close friends for 19 years. They had been next-door neighbors, had been pregnant at the same time, and had raised their children together like sisters. But over the last few years, their friendship had become strained, mostly because of Durante. Lisa absolutely detested Durante. She believed he was manipulative, aggressive, and toxic for Nicole. Whenever Nicole and Durante would temporarily break up, Lisa would be completely blunt about how much she disliked him. Now that Nicole and Durante were back together, it created a lot of tension. Furthermore, Lisa was a very high-energy, loud person. Right now, with her head feeling like it was about to explode, Nicole simply did not have the physical or mental energy to deal with Lisa's intense personality. But Lisa was not going to be ignored. She continued to knock loudly on the door, and then she began calling Nicole's phone. Nicole reached over, her hand shaking from the pain, and silenced the ringer. The heavy knocking continued, and Nicole, feeling desperate for quiet, decided to get up and go to her bedroom. She slowly stood up, her balance completely off, and staggered down the dark hallway to her room. Once inside her bedroom, she made the mistake of parting the window blinds just a fraction of an inch to see if Lisa was leaving. But at that exact moment, Lisa happened to be looking at the bedroom window. The two women made direct eye contact. Lisa's face lit up, and she ran over to the window, tapping on the glass and yelling for Nicole to open the door, saying she knew she was inside and just wanted to help. Feeling embarrassed and utterly exhausted, Nicole shut the blinds, crawled onto her bed, pulled the covers over her head, and ignored her friend until the yelling finally stopped and Lisa walked away. Over the next few weeks, Nicole's life became a living nightmare. The headache did not get better. It got significantly worse. The pain reached a point where she could no longer tolerate any light at all, and even the sound of her own breathing made her wince. Her relationship with Durante also began to rapidly deteriorate. Durante started acting highly impatient and suspicious. He openly accused her of faking the severity of her headaches just so she could lie on the couch all day and avoid working or cleaning. He became cold and distant, which deeply hurt Nicole, who was genuinely suffering. By late June, nearly 5 weeks after the car accident, Nicole was still trapped in the dark apartment. One afternoon, Durante slammed the back door open, stormed into the living room, and began yelling at her, complaining about her laziness. Nicole, pushed to her absolute limit, stood up and told him that they were officially finished and that she wanted him to pack his things and leave her apartment forever. Durante screamed at her, calling her ungrateful after he had spent weeks buying her groceries, but he eventually stormed out, slamming the door behind him. On June 25, 2017, Lisa returned to the apartment. Nicole had texted her to let her know that she and Durante had broken up and that it was finally safe for Lisa to visit without any drama. When Lisa walked through the front door, she was deeply shocked by what she saw. The apartment was in complete, suffocating darkness, and Nicole looked like a ghost. She had lost a significant amount of weight, her skin was pale and sickly, and she was squinting painfully even in the dim light of the hallway. The two women sat at the kitchen table, and Lisa began asking Nicole basic questions about how she was doing. But as Nicole spoke, Lisa felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Nicole's speech was completely slurred, and she was speaking in disjointed, confusing fragments. When Lisa asked what she had eaten that day, Nicole couldn't form a coherent sentence, mumbling random words that made no sense. Lisa grabbed Nicole's hand and told her in a firm, serious voice that this was not a migraine. Something was terribly wrong with her brain, and they were going to the hospital immediately. Nicole, too weak to argue, finally agreed. Lisa helped Nicole into her car and sped to the nearest emergency room. When they arrived, Lisa explained to the triage nurse that Nicole had been suffering from a continuous agonizing headache for 5 weeks, which had started right after she was in a minor car accident. The doctors brought Nicole back to an exam room and began performing standard neurological tests, checking her reflexes and cognitive function, The doctors looked at the small, healed scar on Nicole's forehead. They asked if she had gone to the hospital after the accident, and Nicole explained that she hadn't thought it was necessary because she thought it was just a minor cut from broken window glass. The doctors were deeply concerned by her slurred speech and confusion, fearing she might be suffering from a brain bleed, a stroke, or a severe infection. They immediately ordered a series of high-resolution CT scans of her skull. Nicole was wheeled into the scanning room, and after the imaging was complete, she was brought back to her hospital bed. She lay there in the quiet room, feeling a sense of relief that she was finally in the hands of professionals who could fix whatever was wrong with her. But just a few minutes later, the door to her room flew open. A large team of doctors, nurses, and a man in a business suit rushed inside, all of them looking incredibly pale and serious. The man in the suit walked up to Nicole's bed and introduced himself as a police detective. He held up a printed copy of her brain scan and pointed to a bright, solid white object lodged deep inside her skull. The detective looked at her and asked who had shot her. Nicole stared at him in complete bewilderment. She insisted that no one had shot her and that she had simply been in a car accident where her window shattered. But the detective shook his head, explaining that the bright object on the scan was not a piece of glass. It was a copper-jacketed bullet. The small scar on her forehead was not a glass cut. It was a bullet entry wound. As Nicole listened in shock, the truth of what had happened 5 weeks earlier began to unravel. Her brain, suffering from severe trauma and amnesia, had blocked out the most horrific details of that night. On the night of the accident, Nicole and Durante had returned to her apartment after attending a house party. Nicole was furious because Durante had been openly flirting with another woman. They got into a screaming match, and Durante declared he was leaving her. He began packing his belongings into his car, which was parked directly in front of hers in the driveway. Nicole, wanting to make sure he didn't steal any of her property, went outside and sat in the driver's seat of her own car. In a fit of anger and frustration, Nicole started her engine, drove forward, and intentionally bumped the back of Durante's car. Durante, absolutely enraged, threw his car into reverse, slammed on the gas, and rammed her car so hard that she was pushed back into her fence. This was the last thing Nicole's brain remembered, but the police investigation revealed what happened next. Durante got out of his car, pulled a handgun from his waistband, walked up to the driver's side window of Nicole's car, and shot her directly in the forehead through the glass. The bullet pierced her skull and lodged deep inside her brain, instantly knocking her unconscious. Instead of calling for help, Durante carried her limp, bleeding body into his car and drove her to his mother's house. He lied to his mother, claiming Nicole was highly intoxicated and had been injured by flying glass in a minor car crash. His mother, believing his lie, cleaned the wound with antiseptic, put a bandage on it, and let her sleep. Because of the unique angle of the shot, the bullet had miraculously missed the major arteries and critical speech and motor centers of Nicole's brain, allowing her to survive. When she woke up the next morning, her brain, traumatized by the shooting, had completely erased the memory of being shot, leaving her to believe Durante's lie that her head was simply injured by broken glass. For 5 weeks, Nicole had walked, talked, and lived with a bullet lodged in her brain, while her boyfriend Durante visited her regularly, bringing her groceries and acting as if nothing had happened, all while knowing he was the one who had put the bullet in her head. The doctors delivered devastating news to Nicole. Because 5 weeks had passed, her brain tissue had completely healed and scarred over around the bullet. Attempting to surgically remove it would cause catastrophic, irreversible brain damage or death. She would have to live the rest of her life with the bullet permanently lodged in her head. Durante immediately fled the state when he realized the hospital had discovered the bullet. He managed to evade a massive police manhunt for 2 years, but investigators finally tracked him down to a house in Atlanta. After a tense, hours-long standoff where he hid in the attic, he finally surrendered. He was convicted of aggravated assault and attempted murder and was sentenced to 25 years in prison, while Nicole was left to deal with the permanent, painful physical and mental scars of his horrific betrayal. Finally, we go to our fourth story, which takes us deep into the legendary sun-scorched peaks of Arizona, where a man chasing a long-lost fortune became the victim of a mysterious killer, leaving behind a puzzle that investigators have never been able to fully solve. Late on the afternoon of June 14, 1931, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Adolf Ruth climbed stiffly off the back of his donkey. He stood in the middle of a dusty, rocky canyon, shaking his legs to work out the painful cramps that had built up after hours of riding through the brutal heat of the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looked up at the towering, jagged stone cliffs surrounding him, and let out a deep, satisfied sigh. To the average person, this landscape would look incredibly intimidating and hostile. The Superstition Mountains were a vast, sun-scorched maze of sheer rock walls, deep, shadow-filled canyons, and hidden caves. It was an incredibly easy place to get lost, and the harsh desert heat and lack of water made it deadly. But Dr. Ruth was not intimidated. In fact, he was absolutely thrilled. He was convinced that he was standing on the precipice of finding the legendary lost Dutchman gold mine, a mythical treasure that had captured the imaginations of gold seekers for nearly a century. Over the years, hundreds of treasure hunters had ventured into these unforgiving mountains looking for the mine, but almost none of them had returned. Many had simply vanished without a trace, while others were later found dead, often with their heads missing or showing clear signs of foul play. The locals whispered that the mountains were cursed, guarded by unseen forces or hostile protectors who would brutally murder anyone who got too close to the gold, but Dr. Adolf Ruth believed he had an advantage that no one else had ever possessed. He had a genuine, authentic treasure map. He reached into his leather pack, feeling the rough edges of the old fragile paper folded carefully inside his notebook. This map had a fascinating history. Dr. Ruth's son, who worked as a government official, had acquired it from a Mexican gentleman whose ancestors had allegedly mined gold in the Superstition Mountains generations ago, before their entire expedition was reportedly massacred by Apache warriors. The map had been passed down through the family, and now it was in the hands of Dr. Ruth. As Dr. Ruth stood there, daydreaming about the immense wealth and fame that awaited him, he was startled by a loud, impatient grunt behind him. He whipped his head around and looked at his two companions. They were rugged, local cowboys whom Dr. Ruth had hired to guide him and carry his heavy supplies into the foothills of the mountains. Dr. Ruth was a retired veterinarian and a former government clerk from Washington, D.C. He was a small, physically frail man who walked with a severe, permanent limp due to an old hip injury. From the moment they had set out, the two cowboys had treated him with open condescension, making it clear they thought he was just a foolish, weak old man who was going to get himself killed in the desert. Dr. Ruth deeply resented their attitude. He wanted to prove to everyone that he was a capable explorer. Because of this, he had made a deal with the cowboys. They would guide him to a specific drop-off point deep inside the canyons, and from there, they would leave him. He would camp and search for the mine entirely on his own. Now that they had reached the designated spot, the cowboys hesitated. They looked at the steep, winding canyon walls ahead and then looked down at the frail older man with his limp and his donkey. One of the cowboys cleared his throat and told Dr. Ruth that it was highly dangerous to go into the inner canyons alone, urging him to turn back. But Dr. Ruth's pride was wounded. He angrily snapped at them, telling them he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself. He pulled out his wallet, handed them their payment, and ordered them to leave. The cowboys shrugged, pocketed the cash, turned their horses around, and galloped back down the trail, their dust clouds slowly settling in the hot air. As the sound of their horses' hooves faded into the distance, Dr. Ruth was left standing in absolute silence. For the first time, a cold wave of apprehension washed over him. The canyons suddenly felt incredibly massive, and the silence was deafening. But he shook off the fear, reminded himself of the map in his pocket, hopped back onto his donkey, and began riding deeper into the labyrinth of rock. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the canyon walls in deep shades of red and purple, Dr. Ruth decided to set up camp. He found a small, flat clearing near the base of a cliff, pitched his small canvas tent, and built a modest campfire. He rolled a large, smooth boulder over to the fire to use as a seat, sat down, and pulled the fragile treasure map from his pack. He held the map up to the firelight, studying the faded Spanish handwriting and hand-drawn landmarks. His eyes drifted to a prominent, towering rock formation way off in the distance. It was a massive, needle-like spire of stone that jutted straight up into the sky, casting a long, dark shadow across the canyon floor. It looked remarkably like a giant, dark gravestone. On the map, there was a drawing that perfectly matched this spire, labeled Weaver's Needle. According to the map, the entrance to the gold mine was located directly within the shadow cast by Weaver's Needle. Dr. Adolf Ruth folded the map, tucked it safely away, and ate a simple dinner of canned beans. The darkness that settled over the canyon was absolute, thicker than anything he had ever experienced in the city. To comfort himself, he began to whistle, the cheerful sound echoing eerily off the stone walls. Suddenly, his whistling stopped. High up on the steep cliffs above his campsite, he heard a distinct sound. It was the sharp, metallic click of iron horseshoes striking against solid rock. The rhythmic walking sound echoed clearly through the night. At first, Dr. Ruth felt a surge of relief, thinking another explorer or perhaps a park ranger was nearby. He stood up and called out into the darkness, asking who was there. But there was no answer. The hoofbeats instantly stopped, and the canyon fell into a suffocating silence, followed shortly by the chilling, distant howling of coyotes. A deep, primal fear took hold of Dr. Ruth. He remembered the dark legends of the mountains, of mysterious snipers and hidden guardians who watched trespassers from the shadows. He quickly extinguished his fire, crawled into his tent, and pulled his revolver from its holster, clutching it tightly as he lay in his sleeping bag staring at the canvas door. Hours later, he woke up from a restless sleep. The night was dead silent. He looked toward the open flap of his tent. In the darkness outside, about 20 feet away, he saw two glowing eyes. They were perfectly still, staring directly into his tent with an unblinking, chilling intensity. Dr. Ruth's heart hammered in his chest. He raised his revolver, pointed it at the eyes, and screamed that he would shoot if they came any closer. The moment he spoke, the eyes blinked and vanished into the darkness. He stayed awake for the rest of the night, but the intruder did not return. At first light, Dr. Ruth crawled out of his tent to search for tracks. He found plenty of coyote paw prints, but then his blood ran cold. Just 15 feet from his tent, there was a set of human footprints. They were incredibly small, like those of a young child, and they were completely barefoot. The tracks clearly showed that someone had quietly walked up to his tent in the dead of night and circled it multiple times while he slept. Terrified but determined not to give up on his dream of gold, Dr. Ruth packed his camp, loaded his donkey, and headed straight toward Weaver's Needle. By midday, he was standing in the deep, cool shadow of the massive stone spire. He consulted his map, which led him past a bizarre landmark, a cluster of tall cacti, each of which had a rusty iron axe head deeply embedded in its flesh, the wooden handles long since rotted away. Dr. Ruth realized with a jolt of excitement that the map was incredibly accurate. This was the exact spot marked on the Spanish parchment. He was standing right on top of the lost Dutchman gold mine. He grabbed his pickaxe, took a step toward a nearby rock crevice, and prepared to dig. But before he could strike the stone, he heard a faint rustle of gravel behind him. He started to turn his head, but he was too late. A deafening gunshot shattered the canyon silence, and Dr. Ruth collapsed into the dirt, everything turning to black. 10 days later, the two cowboy guides returned to the drop-off point to check on the elderly doctor. They found his campsite completely abandoned. His tent was still standing, and his supplies were untouched, but there was no sign of Dr. Ruth or his donkey. A massive search party was organized, consisting of local deputies, experienced trackers, and volunteers. For 45 days, they combed every inch of the canyons around Weaver's Needle, but they found absolutely nothing. The search was eventually called off, and it was assumed that the fragile doctor had simply succumbed to the heat or fallen into a deep crevice. But in December of 1931, 6 months after Dr. Ruth had vanished, a group of hikers exploring the base of Weaver's Needle made a gruesome discovery. Lying in the dirt was a clean white human skull. It was identified as Dr. Adolf Ruth's skull. It had 2 clean, round holes on either side, indicating he had been shot in the head at close range. A month later, searchers found the rest of his skeleton, located more than a mile away from where his skull had been found. His clothes were torn, and his boots and gold hunting equipment were missing. Curiously, despite the obvious bullet holes in his skull and the massive distance between his head and body, the local coroner quickly ruled that Dr. Ruth had died of exposure and natural causes, a ruling that outraged his family and sparked widespread rumors of a massive cover-up. When the police searched Dr. Ruth's recovered personal effects, they found his leather checkbook. Inside, on the very last page, there was a short, chilling note written in an elegant, flowing handwriting that did not match Dr. Ruth's. It simply read, "Veni vidi vici. I came, I saw, I conquered." Many believe that the mysterious killer who stalked and murdered Dr. Ruth had written the note as a boast, mocking the foolish old man who had tried to find the forbidden gold. Years later, in 1945, an author named Barry Storm traveled into the Superstition Mountains to investigate Dr. Ruth's murder. While exploring the area near Weaver's Needle, someone began firing a high-powered rifle at him from the cliffs above. Storm was forced to flee for his life, and he later warned the public that the guardians of the lost Dutchman mine were still very real and still very deadly. To this day, the gold has never been found, and the Superstition Mountains continue to guard their dark, deadly secrets. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.